Sherlock Holmes and the Riddle of the Tragic Medallion. Chapter 1. The peculiar client. It was a dreary November evening when the curious affair of the tragic medallion began. The wind howled through the chimney of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, and rain battered against the windows with a persistence that had not relented for 3 days. I had spent the afternoon organizing my notes on Holmes's recent triumph in the case of the Lambeth forgeries, while my friend had retreated into one of his periodic silences, hunched over his chemistry apparatus with the single-minded focus that characterized his experimental moods. The mantel clock had just struck 7 when the sharp ring of the doorbell cut through the comfortable silence of our rooms. Holmes looked up from his experiment, a flicker of interest crossing his austere features. "A client, Watson," he remarked, setting aside a test tube filled with some foul-smelling concoction. "And one in considerable distress, judging by the urgency of that ring." "How can you possibly deduce that?" I asked, though I should have known better than to question Holmes's uncanny perceptions. A thin smile played at the corners of his mouth. The bell was pulled with significant force. "Enough that Mrs. Hudson will be most displeased at having her evening disrupted so violently. Only someone in a state of extreme agitation would announce themselves with such vehemence." Before I could respond, we heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs, followed by a softer, more hesitant tread. A moment later, our landlady appeared at the door. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's a matter of life and death." She sounded skeptical, as she often did about the dramatic declarations of Holmes's clients. "Show him in, if you would." "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes responded, tidying away his chemical apparatus with surprising alacrity. The man who entered our sitting room seemed the very embodiment of nervous energy. Tall and slender, with the pale complexion of one who spends little time outdoors, he was dressed in the attire of a gentleman, though his clothes showed signs of hasty dressing. His cravat was askew, and one of his boots was inadequately polished. His dark hair, prematurely streaked with gray, was disheveled, and his eyes darted around the room as though expecting danger from every corner. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Indeed," my friend replied, gesturing to an armchair by the fire. "Please, sir, be seated. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who has been kind enough to chronicle some of my more interesting cases. You may speak freely before him." The stranger collapsed into the chair rather than sat in it, removing his gloves with trembling hands. "My name is Edward Latimer. I have been told that you are a man who can solve the unsolvable, Mr. Holmes. I pray that is true, for I fear I am marked for death." Holmes leaned forward, his keen gray eyes fixed upon our visitor. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Latimer. Leave out no detail, however trivial it may seem to you." Latimer drew a deep breath, making a visible effort to compose himself. "I am the curator of the Danforth collection at the British Museum, specifically the Medieval Artifacts Division. 3 weeks ago, we received a remarkable donation, a collection of Anglo-Saxon relics discovered on an estate in Northumberland. Among these items was a gold medallion of extraordinary craftsmanship, dating from approximately the 9th century. "The tragic medallion of your telegram?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, though I had no inkling of its tragic nature when it first came into my possession." Latimer paused, withdrawing a handkerchief to dab at his forehead despite the chill in the room. 2 days after cataloging the medallion, I received an anonymous letter warning me to return what was never meant to be found. I dismissed it as the work of a crank. We occasionally receive such communications at the museum. "And then?" Holmes prompted. 3 days later, my assistant, young Jenkins, was found dead in the storage room where the Anglo-Saxon artifacts were kept." "Murder?" I asked, horrified. "The police say it was an accident, that he fell from a ladder while retrieving documents from a high shelf. But there was something unnatural about his expression." Latimer shuddered. "And the medallion was found clutched in his hand, though it should have been locked in the secure cabinet across the room." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his expression inscrutable. Continue. A week passed without incident. Then yesterday I received a second letter. Latimer reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he handed to Holmes. This time, the threat was unmistakable. Holmes unfolded the paper carefully. The message, composed of letters cut from a newspaper and pasted onto the page, read simply, "The medallion claims its second victim soon. Return it or die." "Most interesting," Holmes murmured, holding the paper up to the light. "Cheap newsprint, common paste. The materials offer us little. The cutting is precise, suggesting patience and a steady hand." He set the letter aside. "Tell me, Mr. Latimer, have you noticed anyone paying unusual attention to you or to the medallion since its arrival at the museum?" "There was one incident," Latimer replied, frowning in concentration. "A week ago I observed a man, foreign in appearance, perhaps Eastern European, studying the display case most intently. When I approached, he hurried away. The following day I glimpsed what appeared to be the same man watching the museum entrance from across the street. Can you describe him? Tall, gaunt, with a most distinctive scar across his left cheek. He wore his collar turned up and a hat pulled low, but the scar was unmistakable." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And the medallion itself, what makes it significant beyond its historical value?" Latimer hesitated. "That's what puzzles me most, Mr. Holmes. While beautifully crafted, it is not particularly valuable compared to other pieces in the collection. It bears the image of a serpent devouring its own tail. The Ouroboros symbol, surrounding what appears to be a runic inscription. Our linguist has been unable to decipher it fully, claiming the runes are in a dialect he's unfamiliar with. Most curious." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace the room, his lean figure casting elongated shadows in the firelight. "Mr. Latimer, I shall need to examine this medallion. Can you arrange access to it tomorrow morning?" "Certainly. I have temporary authority to remove it from the museum for expert consultation. In fact..." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "After receiving the second threat, I thought it prudent to keep it with me. I feared leaving it at the museum might endanger my colleagues." With evident reluctance, Latimer placed the pouch on the table between us. Holmes untied the drawstring and carefully tipped the contents onto his palm. The medallion that slid out was approximately the size of a crown piece, crafted from gold that had been darkened by age. The workmanship was exquisite. The serpent that formed the outer circle was rendered in minute detail, each scale individually etched. Within the circle, strange angular symbols formed a pattern that seemed to my untrained eye both mesmerizing and vaguely disturbing. As Holmes examined it, turning it over in his long fingers, I experienced a curious sensation, a momentary dizziness, accompanied by what I could only describe as a sense of profound unease. I dismissed it as fatigue, though I noticed that our client seemed similarly affected, watching the medallion with a mixture of fascination and dread. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured again, holding the medallion up to the light. "Watson, your magnifying glass, if you please." I handed him the instrument and he bent over the artifact, studying it intently. After several minutes of silent examination, he returned the medallion to its pouch and addressed our visitor. "Mr. Latimer, I shall take your case. For tonight you will stay here under the watchful eye of Dr. Watson. I have some inquiries to make which cannot wait until morning." "You believe I am in immediate danger, then?" Latimer asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I believe caution is warranted," Holmes replied diplomatically. "Watson is not only an excellent physician but a military man of proven courage. You could not ask for a more capable guardian." Before I could express my surprise at being volunteered for this duty, Holmes had donned his coat and hat and was heading for the door. "Holmes," I called after him, "where are you going at this hour in such weather?" He paused, a glint of excitement in his eyes that I had come to recognize as the harbinger of a challenging case. To consult an authority on ancient symbols, my dear Watson, and perhaps to prevent another tragedy before it unfolds." With that cryptic remark, he was gone, leaving me with our nervous client and the distinct impression that we had stumbled upon a mystery far more complex than it initially appeared. Chapter 2. The Scholar's Insight. The remainder of that evening passed in uneasy silence. Mr. Latimer, despite my attempts at reassuring conversation, remained tense and vigilant, starting at every creak of the old building and distant footfall from the street below. It was well past midnight when he finally succumbed to exhaustion, dozing fitfully in the armchair while I maintained my watch from the opposite side of the room, service revolver within easy reach. Holmes did not return until shortly after dawn, his appearance suggesting a night spent in less than comfortable circumstances. His collar was rumpled, his normally immaculate cuffs stained with what appeared to be ink, and there was a smudge of dust across one cheek. Yet his eyes were bright, with the fervor of intellectual discovery. "Ah, Watson," he said quietly, noting our sleeping guest, "I see our friend has managed some rest. Good. He will need his wits about him today." "And what of you?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Have your inquiries yielded anything of value?" Holmes removed his coat, hanging it carefully before the fire, to dry. "Indeed they have. I spent several hours in consultation with Professor Blackwood at Oxford. The man is insufferably pompous, but possesses an unrivaled knowledge of Anglo-Saxon artifacts." "At Oxford? Holmes, that's 60 miles away." A thin smile crossed his face. "The last train to Oxford departed shortly after I left you. The professor was not pleased to be roused from his bed, but his irritation gave way to scholarly excitement once I showed him sketches of the medallion." "And his verdict?" "Most illuminating. The medallion is indeed 9th century, but its provenance is not as straightforward as Mr. Latimer believes. According to Blackwood, it bears striking similarities to artifacts associated with a secretive pagan cult that persisted in northern England long after the official conversion to Christianity." Mr. Latimer, who had awakened during our conversation, sat upright with alarm. "A pagan cult? There was nothing in the documentation accompanying the donation to suggest such a connection." "That is hardly surprising," Holmes replied, accepting the cup of tea I had poured for him. "The family who made the donation would hardly advertise their ancestors' involvement in forbidden practices. But the medallion tells its own tale, for those who know how to read it." "The runic inscription?" Latimer asked. "Precisely. Blackwood was able to translate portions of it. The text refers to binding the serpent's power and the guardian sacrifice. More intriguingly, it mentions a specific ritual to be performed during a celestial alignment." "What sort of ritual?" I inquired, a sense of foreboding growing within. Holmes' expression grew somber. The professor was reluctant to elaborate, claiming scholarly discretion, but his discomfort was evident. He did, however, direct me to a rare manuscript in the Bodleian Library containing further references to the cult and its practices. "And did you consult this manuscript?" Latimer asked eagerly. "The library was closed, of course, but I was able to persuade the night custodian to grant me access. The text confirmed my growing suspicions." Holmes paused, his gray eyes focused on some middle distance as he organized his thoughts. "The medallion was never meant as mere ornamentation, Mr. Latimer. It was a key of sorts, a talisman used in rituals of significant importance to the cult." "A key to what?" I wondered aloud. "That remains unclear. But according to the manuscript, the medallion was believed to hold great power, power that could be unleashed only by one who understood its secrets." Holmes set down his teacup and leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Latimer, what do you know of the Northumberland estate where the medallion was discovered?" "Very little," he admitted. "The donation came through an intermediary, a solicitor representing the Hargreaves family. The letter accompanying the artifacts stated merely that they had been discovered during renovations of the east wing of Ravenswood Manor. which has been in the family's possession since the Norman conquest. Ravenswood, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. The name is familiar. Watson, would you be so kind as to fetch my index of notable country estates? The blue volume on the second shelf. I located the book and handed it to him. Holmes thumbed through it with practiced efficiency, stopping at a page near the middle. Here we are, Ravenswood Manor, Northumberland. Originally constructed in 1097, significant additions in the 14th and 18th centuries. Current owner, Sir Richard Hargreaves, the 7th Baronet. He looked up at Latimer. There is a brief historical note of interest. The east wing, damaged by fire in 1426, was said to have been built upon the foundations of a pre-Christian temple or ritual site. Good heavens, Latimer murmured. Could there be a connection? It would be a remarkable coincidence otherwise, Holmes replied dryly. But we require more information before drawing firm conclusions. He turned to me. Watson, while you were playing Sentinel, did our client share any further details about his assistant's death? No, I replied, though he mentioned having nightmares about it. Latimer nodded miserably. They are most vivid. I see Jenkins' face, contorted in terror, the medallion clutched in his rigid fingers. He shuddered. And always, in the dream, there is a tall figure watching from the shadows. A figure with a scarred face. Holmes's eyes narrowed. This scarred man? You are certain you saw him at the museum? Absolutely certain. His appearance was most distinctive. Then perhaps it is time we visited the scene of young Jenkins' death, Holmes declared, rising to his feet. Mr. Latimer, can you arrange immediate access to the storage room where the body was discovered? Of course. The police have concluded their investigation, so the room has been unsealed. But what do you hope to find, Mr. Holmes? The police were thorough in their examination. A thin smile played at the corners of Holmes's mouth. The police see but they do not observe. They seek evidence to support their predetermined theory of accidental death. I seek the truth, whatever it may be. He glanced at the mantel clock. It is nearly 8. Shall we say we will meet you at the British Museum at 9? Latimer agreed readily and took his leave, visibly relieved to have Holmes's assistance yet still haunted by fear. Once he had departed, I turned to my friend with a question that had been troubling me. Holmes, you haven't shared your initial impressions of the medallion itself. Did you notice anything significant that Latimer might have missed? Holmes, who had been refilling his pipe, paused thoughtfully. Several things, Watson. The wear patterns on the reverse side suggest it was handled frequently in a specific manner, grasped by the edges rather than the center. And there were minute traces of a residue in the grooves of the runic inscription. What sort of residue? That, said Holmes, striking a match, is what I intend to determine today. The laboratory at St. Bartholomew's should have the necessary equipment. He exhaled a cloud of smoke. But come, Watson, we must. Chapter 3. The scene of tragedy. The British Museum presented an imposing silhouette against the morning sky as our hansom cab pulled to a stop before its grand entrance. The rain had ceased, but a heavy mist clung to the streets, shrouding the city in a ghostly pallor that seemed fitting given the nature of our investigation. Edward Latimer awaited us at the staff entrance, his haggard appearance suggesting he had found little rest after leaving our lodgings. He led us through a labyrinth of corridors, past glass cases containing treasures from civilizations long vanished, until we reached a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. This is the primary storage area for the medieval collection, he explained, producing a key from his waistcoat pocket. Jenkins was found there, at the foot of the ladder. His hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the door. The room beyond was cavernous, lined with metal shelving units and wooden cabinets that reached nearly to the ceiling. Despite the electric lights that had been installed, shadows gathered in the corners, and the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. Or perhaps, given recent events, suppressed dread. "Show me precisely where the body was discovered," Holmes instructed, his keen eyes already scanning the room. Latimer pointed to a spot near the far wall, where a rolling ladder was positioned beside a tall cabinet. There, he was lying face up, arms outstretched, the medallion clutched in his right hand. Holmes moved to the indicated area, dropping to one knee to examine the floor. "And the medallion should have been where?" "In the secure case over there," Latimer said, indicating a glass-fronted cabinet on the opposite wall. "It was locked. I checked it myself the evening before, yet somehow it was found in Jenkins' hand. Most curious." Holmes rose and approached the secure cabinet, examining its lock with his magnifying glass. "No signs of forced entry. Who, besides yourself, has keys to this cabinet?" "Only the director and the head of security." "And Jenkins?" "No, certainly not. He would have had to request access through me." Holmes circled the room slowly, his gaze sweeping the floor, the shelving units, and the ceiling. Suddenly he paused beside a ventilation grate near the floor. "Has this always been here?" he asked, crouching to examine it. Latimer frowned. "Yes, of course. The climate control system was installed throughout the building last year." Holmes prized the grate open with his penknife and peered inside. "How interesting! Watson, your handkerchief, if you please." I handed it to him, and he used it to carefully extract something from within the duct. A small fragment of fabric, dark in color. "What is it?" I asked, leaning closer. "A piece torn from a garment. Good quality wool, with a distinctive herringbone pattern." Holmes held it up to the light. "Notice the frayed edge? This was caught and torn recently." "Surely you don't suggest someone entered through the ventilation system?" Latimer exclaimed. "It's far too small for a man to pass through." "Not a man, perhaps, but an object could be pushed through," Holmes replied. "Or a gas." "A gas?" I repeated, alarmed. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the ladder and examined it minutely, running his fingers along its rails. "Mr. Latimer, you mentioned that the police concluded Jenkins fell from this ladder. Did they specify what caused him to fall?" "They suggested he might have overreached or become dizzy." "Was Jenkins known to suffer from vertigo or any similar condition?" "Not to my knowledge. He was a young man in excellent health." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And his expression, you described it as unnatural. Can you elaborate?" Latimer shuddered visibly. "It was one of absolute terror, Mr. Holmes. His eyes were wide open, his mouth contorted in a silent scream. I've never seen anything like it." "As if he had seen something that frightened him severely," I suggested. "Or experienced something," Holmes added. He turned back to Latimer. "I should like to speak with the person who found the body. That would be Mrs. Winters, our cleaning woman. She arrives at 6 each morning. Then let us speak with her immediately." Mrs. Winters proved to be a sturdy woman of middle years, with the weathered hands and practical demeanor of one accustomed to hard work. She received us in the small break room where she was taking her mid-morning tea. "It was a terrible thing, sir," she said after Holmes had introduced himself and explained our purpose. "I've worked here 15 years and never seen anything like it. Poor Mr. Jenkins, such a polite young gentleman he was." "You discovered him at what time precisely?" Holmes inquired. "Just after 6, sir. I always start with the storage rooms. Less disruption that way before the scholars arrive." "And the room was locked?" "Yes, sir. I have my own key. Need it for my duties." "Did you notice anything unusual when you entered? Any strange odor, perhaps?" Mrs. Winters considered this. "Now that you mention it, there was a queer smell. Faint, mind you, but not the usual mustiness of that room. Something sharper, like when my husband cleans his old service pistol." "Gunpowder?" I suggested. "Similar, but not quite," she replied. "And there was something else." She hesitated, as if embarrassed. "Please, Mrs. Winters," Holmes encouraged her. Any detail, however seemingly trivial, could be important. It's just, when I found him, I thought at first he might still be alive. I rushed to him, tried to feel for a pulse. She shuddered. His skin was ice cold, sir. Colder than it should have been, even for someone who'd passed. And there was a strange discoloration around his fingernails, a sort of bluish tint. Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. As a medical man, I recognized the symptoms she described as consistent with certain types of poisoning. One final question, Mrs. Winters, Holmes said. In the days before Mr. Jenkins' death, did you notice any strangers in or near the storage room? Someone who perhaps didn't belong? The cleaning woman's brow furrowed in concentration. There was a gentleman, tall fellow with a foreign look about him. I saw him speaking with Mr. Jenkins 2 days before. They seemed to be arguing, though they fell silent when they noticed me. Can you describe this man? Dark clothes, expensive by the look of them. He kept his face partly turned away, but I glimpsed what looked like a scar on his cheek. Holmes thanked Mrs. Winters for her assistance, and once we had left her company, turned to Latimer with a grave expression. Mr. Latimer, I believe Jenkins's death was neither accident nor simple murder, but something far more calculated. I must examine the medallion again, under proper laboratory conditions. Latimer handed over the leather pouch containing the artifact. You think it's connected to his death? How? That remains to be determined. But I advise you in the strongest possible terms to take precautions for your own safety. Do not stay alone tonight. Holmes pocketed the medallion. Watson and I have further inquiries to make. We shall call upon you this evening with our findings. As we departed the museum, I could not help but notice the tension in Holmes's normally composed features. You have a theory? I ventured once we were seated in another cab. Several, he replied grimly. None of them pleasant. We must make haste to St. Bartholomew's. There are tests I need to conduct immediately. To make haste. The game is afoot, and I fear time is not on our side. Chapter 1. Chemical Revelations. St. Bartholomew's Hospital welcomed us with its familiar blend of antiseptic scents and hushed efficiency. Holmes, a frequent visitor to its laboratories, navigated the corridors with practiced ease, acknowledging the occasional greeting from staff members who recognized him from previous investigations. Dr. Stamford, an old acquaintance who had first introduced Holmes and me years earlier, granted us use of a small but well-equipped laboratory. Within minutes, Holmes had arranged his materials with methodical precision. Several test tubes, an assortment of chemicals, a Bunsen burner, and a powerful microscope. Watson, he said, carefully removing the medallion from its pouch, I should value your medical opinion during these tests. 2 sets of trained eyes are better than 1. I positioned myself beside him as he placed the medallion under the microscope and bent to examine it, adjusting the focus with delicate precision. Extraordinary, he murmured after several moments. The residue is concentrated within the deepest grooves of the runes. See for yourself. I took his place at the microscope. At first I saw only the intricate metalwork, but as I adjusted the focus, I detected a faint crystalline substance embedded in the engraved characters. Some kind of crystallized salt? I suggested. Possibly. Let us find out. Holmes carefully scraped a minute amount of the substance into a test tube, added a clear solution, and held it over the Bunsen burner's flame. The liquid turned a distinctive violet color. Just as I suspected, Holmes said, his expression grim. The residue contains traces of atropine, a powerful alkaloid derived from plants of the nightshade family. Belladonna, I said, recognizing the test result. A powerful poison in sufficient quantities. Indeed, but there's something else present. Something I cannot immediately identify. Holmes prepared another sample and subjected it to a different test. This time, the reaction produced a peculiar effervescence and an odor that made my nostrils flare. Good heavens, I exclaimed. That's a derivative of prussic acid. Holmes finished for me. Highly toxic, especially when vaporized. I stared at the medallion with newfound wariness. You think Jenkins was poisoned through contact with this? Not exactly. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A familiar posture of deep contemplation. The quantities present on the medallion are insufficient to cause death through casual handling. However, if the same compounds were present in higher concentration, perhaps in gaseous form. Introduced through the ventilation system, I concluded, recalling the fabric fragment Holmes had discovered. Precisely. A targeted delivery method, affecting only someone in that specific location. Holmes rose and began to pace, a habit that often accompanied his most intense reasoning. Consider the facts, Watson. Jenkins dies in a locked room apparently from a fall, yet with symptoms suggestive of poisoning. The medallion, which should have been securely locked away, is found clutched in his hand. A mysterious foreigner with a scarred face is seen arguing with him shortly before his death. And now Latimer is receiving threats, I added. Yes, but why? What makes this particular artifact worth killing for? Holmes stopped pacing and carefully examined the medallion again, this time with his naked eye, turning it in the light. The workmanship is exceptional, but as Latimer noted, its monetary value is not extraordinary. Could the value be symbolic, rather than material? You mentioned a pagan cult. Indeed. Holmes nodded approvingly. The cult's practices, according to Professor Blackwood, involved ceremonial sacrifice during specific astronomical alignments. The medallion was believed to channel mystical energies when activated by the correct ritual. Surely you don't suggest there's truth to such superstitions? A thin smile crossed Holmes's face. I deal in facts, Watson, not superstitions. Yet people have committed murder for less tangible beliefs than these. He frowned suddenly. There's something scratched on the edge here. Something that doesn't match the original craftsmanship. He adjusted the microscope again and motioned for me to look. There, barely visible along the medallion's edge, was a series of tiny marks that appeared to have been added much more recently than the original engravings. Numbers, I observed. Quite crudely etched, compared to the original workmanship. 6 digits, Holmes confirmed. 397241. A code of some sort, or perhaps coordinates. Or a date? September 7th, 1924, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. Too far in the future. More likely it refers to a location. He carefully returned the medallion to its pouch. We've learned what we can here. Our next step is to consult the museum records regarding the Hargreaves donation. I need to know exactly what other artifacts accompanied this medallion. We departed St. Bartholomew's shortly thereafter, Holmes sending a telegram to Latimer requesting access to the complete acquisition records for the Northumberland collection. As we traveled, Holmes maintained an unusual silence, his brow furrowed, in concentration. You're troubled, I observed as our cab rattled through the London streets. This case has elements that disturb me, Watson. The calculated nature of Jenkins' murder suggests a methodical mind, yet the choice of poison, combining atropine with a prussic acid derivative, indicates someone with both extensive chemical knowledge and a flair for the theatrical. How so? Atropine causes hallucinations before death. Combined with the prussic compound, the victim would experience terrifying visions while suffocating. It explains Jenkins' expression of horror and the blue discoloration Mrs. Winters observed. I shuddered at the thought. A particularly cruel method of killing, and one designed to evoke the ritualistic aspects of the medallion's origins. Holmes gazed out at the passing streets, his profile sharp against the gray London light. Our adversary is not merely seeking to retrieve the medallion. He's employing its mythology as psychological warfare against those who possess it. To what end? That, Holmes said grimly, is what we must discover before Latimer meets the same fate as Jenkins. We arrived at the museum just as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Latimer was waiting for us in his cluttered office, a stack of documents, already prepared on his desk. "The complete records of the Hargreaves donation," he said, indicating the papers, including photographs of each item and their initial assessment. Holmes immediately began to examine the documents with his customary thoroughness. "Mr. Latimer," he said without looking up, "these records mention a partial manuscript found alongside the medallion. Where is it now?" "In the document preservation department. It's quite fragile. Several parchment pages written in a combination of Latin and Anglo-Saxon runes." "I must see it," Holmes declared, setting aside the papers. "Immediately." Latimer hesitated. "The preservation team is quite protective of their materials, Mr. Holmes. They don't allow—" "A man's life may depend on it," Holmes interrupted. "Yours, specifically." The curator's face paled. "I'll take you there at once." Chapter 5. Fragments of the Past. The Document Preservation Department occupied the basement level of the museum's East Wing, a climate-controlled sanctuary where the fragile remnants of history were meticulously examined and restored. Miss Eleanor Winters, the department head, received us with thinly veiled irritation at our unscheduled intrusion into her domain. "These manuscripts are extremely delicate, Mr. Holmes," she admonished, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles. "Exposure to light and unregulated humidity can cause irreparable damage." "I assure you, Miss Winters, I understand the value of what you protect," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic diplomacy. "I require only a brief examination, under your expert supervision, of course." His flattery, though transparent to me, had the desired effect. Miss Winters' severe expression softened slightly as she led us to a workstation, where several parchment pages lay beneath a protective glass case. "The Hargreaves manuscript fragments," she explained, her professional interest evidently overcoming her initial resistance. "Fascinating material, though incomplete. We believe they were torn from a larger codex, possibly during the Reformation, when many pagan texts were destroyed." Holmes leaned over the glass, his keen eyes scanning the yellowed parchment. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the magnifying apparatus positioned beside the case. Miss Winters nodded reluctantly and adjusted the specialized equipment, allowing Holmes to examine the manuscript without direct handling. The parchment was covered in faded brown ink, the text arranged in two columns, one in Latin, the other in angular runic characters. Crude illustrations decorated the margins, serpents intertwined with human figures, celestial diagrams, and repeated images of the Ouroboros symbol that matched the medallion. "Have you translated the text?" Holmes inquired. "Partially," Miss Winters replied. "The Latin portions describe a ritual involving celestial alignments and the binding of otherworldly forces. The runic sections have proven more challenging. They appear to be written in a deliberately obscure dialectical variant, possibly to conceal their meaning from uninitiated readers." "Or from the church authorities," Holmes suggested. "Precisely." Miss Winters seemed impressed by his insight. "We've managed to decipher references to a guardian's blood sacrifice and repeated mentions of the serpent's gate or doorway." "Gateway to what?" I wondered aloud. Miss Winters hesitated. "The text is ambiguous, but suggests some form of transition between worlds or states of being. Typical mystical imagery of the period, though unusually specific in its astronomical references." Holmes's attention had fixed on a particular illustration, a circular diagram showing planetary positions with the Ouroboros encircling them. "This configuration," he said, pointing without touching the glass. "Does it correspond to any particular date?" "According to our astronomers, it depicts a rare alignment that would have occurred in late October of the year 897 AD. And rather remarkably, a similar alignment will occur again tomorrow night," Holmes finished for her, his expression grave. Miss Winters looked startled. "Why, yes, how did you know?" "The numbers scratched on the medallion. Holmes explained. Not a date or coordinates as we first thought, Watson, but an astronomical reference. The digits correspond to the relative positions of celestial bodies. During this alignment, a chill ran through me as I grasped the implication. Then whoever killed Jenkins and is threatening Latimer intends to use the medallion during tomorrow night's alignment, Holmes confirmed, straightening from his examination. Miss Winters, is there any indication in the text of the specific location where this ritual was to be performed? She shook her head. Not explicitly, though there are references to a circle of standing stones where the serpent's tail meets its head at the moment of alignment. Standing stones, Latimer murmured. There's a partially ruined stone circle on the Hargreaves estate, mentioned in the donation documentation as being near where the artifacts were discovered. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the intensity I had come to recognize as the precursor to a breakthrough. Mr. Latimer, I believe it's time we paid a visit to Ravenswood Manor. How quickly can you arrange it? I could telegraph Sir Richard Hargreaves immediately, Latimer stammered. But Northumberland is a considerable journey. Then we have no time to waste, Holmes declared. The night train leaves King's Cross at 8. We must be on it. We departed the museum with haste, Holmes dispatching a street urchin to Baker Street with instructions for Mrs. Hudson to pack traveling bags for both of us. While Latimer sent his telegram, Holmes stepped aside to speak with me privately. Watson, I believe we face a dangerous adversary who combines meticulous planning with fanatic devotion to ancient mysticism, he said in a low voice. I would not ask you to accompany us to Northumberland if I did not believe your steady nerves and reliable revolver might prove essential. You suspect an ambush? I suspect that our scarred friend has been anticipating this celestial alignment for some time and will not allow anyone to interfere with his plans for the medallion. Holmes glanced at Latimer, who was still occupied at the telegraph office. Our curator friend is in far greater danger than he realizes. Do you think this cultist truly believes the medallion possesses supernatural properties? I asked. Holmes' expression was unusually somber. What matters is not whether such powers exist, but that our adversary believes they do. Faith, even misplaced faith, can drive men to extraordinary acts of violence. Latimer rejoined us, his face flushed with nervous energy. Sir Richard has responded already, most accommodating. He's fascinated by our investigation and has invited us to stay at Ravenswood. He's even offering to send a carriage to meet our train. Excellent, Holmes replied, though I detected a note of reservation in his voice. Did you mention the specific reason for our visit? Only that it concerned the artifacts his family donated, Latimer assured him. I thought it best to be discreet about the threats and poor Jenkins' death. Quite right, Holmes agreed. The fewer who know our true purpose, the better. As we made our preparations for departure, I could not shake a growing sense of unease. Holmes appeared outwardly calm, yet I knew him well enough to recognize the subtle signs of heightened alertness in his bearing. The slightly accelerated rhythm of his speech, the increased sharpness of his gaze as it swept our surroundings. You believe we're being watched, I said quietly as we waited on the platform at King's Cross. A thin smile crossed his face. As ever, Watson, you see to the heart of the matter. Yes, I believe our movements are being observed. Notice the tall man by the newspaper stand, the one who has been pretending to read the same page for the past 15 minutes? I glanced discreetly in the indicated direction. The man stood with his back partially turned, his face obscured by his upturned collar and the shadow of his hat. But there was something familiar in his posture. Is that our scarred friend? I believe so, Holmes murmured. He will almost certainly attempt to follow us to Northumberland, which is precisely what I am counting on. You're using us as bait? Latimer whispered, having overheard our exchange. Not bait, Mr. Latimer, Holmes corrected. The hunter must sometimes allow himself to be tracked in order to identify his quarries. True objective. He withdrew his pocket watch. Ah, our train approaches, shall we? As the mighty locomotive pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and screech of brakes, I tightened my grip on my traveling bag, acutely aware of the reassuring weight of my service revolver nestled within. Whatever awaited us at Ravenswood Manor, I was certain of one thing. The game that had begun with a museum curator's nervous visit to Baker Street was rapidly approaching its deadly climax. Chapter 6. Journey to Ravenswood. The train journey northward unfolded in tense silence. Holmes had secured a private compartment where Latimer sat with his back to the window, visibly uncomfortable whenever the train passed through the longer tunnels. The medallion, now wrapped in a handkerchief and secured in Holmes' inside pocket, seemed to cast an almost palpable shadow over our expedition. "Tell me more about Sir Richard Hargreaves," Holmes said as the train clattered through the darkened countryside. "You mentioned he was immediately receptive to our visit." Latimer nodded. "Sir Richard is something of an enthusiast regarding his family's history. When the artifacts were discovered during renovations, he personally oversaw their cataloging before donating them to the museum. He retained several pieces of lesser significance for his private collection, including any documents or manuscripts." "None that were mentioned in the inventory," Latimer replied, "though I suppose he might have kept items he deemed of purely familial interest." Holmes gazed pensively at the passing darkness beyond the window. "The Hargreaves family has owned Ravenswood since the Norman conquest, you said. Have they always maintained residence there?" "Not continuously. The estate was abandoned for nearly 50 years following a scandal in the 1860s. Sir Richard's father reclaimed and restored it shortly before the turn of the century." "What manner of scandal?" I inquired. Latimer shifted uncomfortably. "The details are somewhat obscure, but it involved the previous baronet, Sir William Hargreaves. Rumors of unorthodox religious practices, mysterious disappearances of local villagers. Nothing was ever proven, but the family reputation suffered tremendously." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And when exactly did the renovation work uncover the artifacts?" "Approximately 6 weeks ago. The East Wing had remained largely untouched since the restoration. Sir Richard decided to modernize it for his son's upcoming return from diplomatic service abroad." Holmes fell silent again, his fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the armrest. After several minutes, he suddenly rose and moved to the compartment door. "I believe I shall stretch my legs," he announced. "The dining car should still be open." "Shall we accompany you?" I asked, sensing that he had some purpose beyond mere restlessness. "No need, Watson. Keep Mr. Latimer company. I shan't be long." The moment Holmes departed, Latimer leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Dr. Watson, do you truly believe there is some curse associated with this medallion? I know Mr. Holmes deals in rational explanations, but these events, Jenkins' death, the threatening letters, this business with ancient rituals, it all seems so—" "Holmes would say that human malice requires no supernatural explanation," I replied, though I could not entirely dismiss the chill that had settled in my own mind. "Whatever power the medallion possesses comes from the value people attribute to it, not from any mystical properties." Latimer did not appear entirely convinced. "Have you noticed how cold it feels to the touch? Colder than metal should be, even gold." Before I could respond, the compartment door slid open, and Holmes reappeared, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Our scarred friend is indeed aboard," he announced without preamble, resuming his seat. "3 carriages forward. He's traveling as a German businessman, though his accent is distinctly Slavic." "Did he see you?" Latimer asked anxiously. "I took care to remain unobserved," Holmes assured him. "But his presence confirms my suspicions regarding the significance of tomorrow night's alignment. Should we alert the authorities?" I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. We have suspicions but little concrete evidence. And given the remote location of Ravenswood Manor, local police would be of limited use." He unfolded the newspaper he had brought. "I did, however, acquire this from a fellow passenger. A special astronomical bulletin describing tomorrow's celestial event." We leaned forward to examine the page Holmes indicated. An illustration showed the precise alignment of planets that would occur, accompanied by text, declaring it the most significant such configuration since the late 9th century. "The timing cannot be coincidental," Holmes observed. "Our adversary has planned meticulously, waiting for this specific astronomical event that occurs only once in over 1,000 years. But what does he hope to achieve?" I wondered. "That remains to be seen. But I suspect the stone circle Latimer mentioned will be central to his plan." Holmes turned his penetrating gaze to our nervous companion. "Mr. Latimer, I must ask you to surrender any notion that you might return to London after showing us the estate. Your safety depends on remaining under our protection until this matter is resolved." Latimer paled but nodded his agreement. "I had no intention of abandoning you, Mr. Holmes. My scholarly curiosity, if nothing else, demands that I see this through to its conclusion." "Good man," Holmes said approvingly. "Now, I suggest we attempt to rest. Dawn will find us in Northumberland, and I anticipate a demanding day ahead." Rest, however, proved elusive. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels seemed to echo the pounding of my heart, as my mind conjured images of ancient rituals and modern murder. Holmes, for his part, maintained a state of meditative stillness. His eyes closed, but his posture, suggesting alertness rather than slumber. Only Latimer eventually succumbed to exhaustion, his head lolling against the cushioned seat as the train carried us ever northward. We arrived at the small Northumberland station shortly after daybreak. As promised, a carriage bearing the Hargreaves crest awaited us, attended by a taciturn driver who loaded our modest luggage without comment. "Did you observe our fellow passenger disembarking?" Holmes murmured as we settled into the carriage. "No sign of him," I replied after a careful survey of the platform. "He will follow," Holmes said with certainty. "Though not, I think, by any conveyance we would easily detect." The journey from the station to Ravenswood Manor took us through mist-shrouded moorland, the landscape gradually giving way to denser woodland as we approached our destination. After nearly an hour's travel, the trees parted to reveal our first view of the estate. Ravenswood Manor stood like a sentinel against the morning sky, its gray stone walls rising from a sea of autumn foliage. The central structure dated clearly from Norman times, a square keep with narrow windows and crenellated battlements. Later additions flanked it on either side, a Tudor wing to the west, and most prominently, the newly renovated east wing with its Gothic arches and tall chimneys. "Formidable," I remarked, as our carriage wound up the long approach. "And isolated," Holmes added thoughtfully. "The perfect setting for activities one wishes to keep from prying eyes." The carriage halted before imposing oak doors, which swung open as we descended. A tall man of approximately 50 years, impeccably dressed and bearing himself with aristocratic confidence, stepped forward to greet us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Latimer, welcome to Ravenswood. I am Sir Richard Hargreaves." He extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Your telegram has aroused my keenest interest. I understand you have questions about the artifacts my family donated to the museum." "Indeed, Sir Richard," Holmes replied, studying our host with that penetrating gaze I knew so well. "Questions that may shed light on a most disturbing series of events." Sir Richard's expression grew serious. "Then you must tell me everything. But first, please, come inside. After your journey, you must be in need of refreshment." As we followed our host into the ancestral manor, I could not shake the sensation of being watched, not merely by our mysterious scarred pursuer, but by the very stones of this ancient place, silent witnesses to centuries of Hargreaves family history, and perhaps to secrets darker than any of us yet imagined. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Manor. The interior of Ravenswood Manor presented a striking contrast to its forbidding exterior. The great hall into which Sir Richard led us had been modernized with electric lighting, though oak beams blackened by centuries of smoke still crossed the high ceiling. Family portraits gazed down from paneled walls, their eyes seeming to follow our progress across the polished floor. "You must forgive the mixture of ancient and modern," Sir Richard remarked, as he directed us to comfortable chairs before a massive fireplace. "I am bound by duty to preserve Ravenswood's heritage, but I see no reason to live without contemporary comforts." A silent servant appeared with a tray of tea and refreshments, which our host distributed with practiced courtesy. "Now then," Sir Richard said once we were settled, "Mr. Latimer's telegram was intriguingly vague. Something about the Anglo-Saxon artifacts requiring urgent investigation?" Holmes set his cup aside, fixing our host with his penetrating gaze. "Sir Richard, I must be direct. One man is dead, and Mr. Latimer has received threats connected to a particular item from your family's donation, a gold medallion bearing an Ouroboros symbol and runic inscriptions." Sir Richard's expression registered genuine shock. "Good heavens! Murder! I had no idea the artifacts held such significance." "Then perhaps you could enlighten us about their discovery," Holmes continued. "The precise circumstances might prove illuminating." Our host nodded thoughtfully. "The East Wing renovations uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the foundation stones, a room whose existence was recorded in no family document or architectural plan. Inside, we found a stone chest containing the artifacts, along with the manuscript, fragments Mr. Latimer's museum colleagues have been studying." "Was there anything else in this chamber? Anything not included in the donation?" Holmes asked. A brief hesitation preceded Sir Richard's answer. "A few items of purely sentimental value. Family seals, mainly." Holmes' eyebrow arched slightly, a subtle sign that he had detected some evasion in our host's response. "I would be most interested in seeing the location where the chamber was discovered," Holmes said, "and, if possible, the stone circle mentioned in connection with your estate." "Of course." Sir Richard rose. "The excavation site has been preserved pending architectural decisions about the space. As for the stone circle, it lies approximately half a mile from the house, in a clearing within the eastern woods. I can arrange for my gamekeeper to guide you there this afternoon." "That would be most helpful," Holmes replied. "But first, the chamber, if you please." Sir Richard led us through a series of corridors to the East Wing, where evidence of recent renovation was apparent in the freshly plastered walls and new oak flooring. We descended a narrow staircase to a subterranean level, the air growing noticeably cooler as we proceeded. "The original foundations date from the late Saxon period," Sir Richard explained, unlocking a heavy door at the bottom of the stairs. "This entire area was thought to be solid bedrock until the renovations revealed otherwise. The chamber beyond was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with walls of dressed stone that had been blackened by time or perhaps ancient fires. The ceiling was low, supported by massive oak beams that showed signs of recent reinforcement. In the center stood a rectangular depression in the floor, where presumably the stone chest had rested." Holmes moved about the space with keen interest, examining the walls and floor with his magnifying glass. He paused at several points to study. Peculiar markings carved into the stone, symbols similar to those on the medallion. "These carvings," he said, tracing one with his finger, "they appear to radiate outward from where the chest was positioned. Our historians believe this may have been a pagan temple, later incorporated into the manor's foundations," Sir Richard offered. "Northumberland was slow to embrace Christianity." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his attention now focused on the room's dimensions. "The circular shape is significant, I think. Tell me, Sir Richard, is this chamber directly aligned with the stone circle in the woods?" Our host looked startled by the question. I believe it may be. The family chronicles mention a line of power connecting the circle to the house, though I had always dismissed such references as medieval superstition." "Medieval, or perhaps older," Holmes replied. He turned to address all of us. "I believe this chamber was specifically designed to correspond with the stone circle, both aligned to capture the celestial configuration that will occur tonight." Sir Richard's expression betrayed growing concern. "Mr. Holmes, you seem to be suggesting some connection between these ancient alignments and the threat to Mr. Latimer. Surely that's far-fetched, is it?" Holmes withdrew the medallion from his pocket, unwrapping it carefully. This artifact was at the center of Jenkins' death and the threats against Mr. Latimer. It bears the same symbols we see carved here, and its recent addition of astronomical notations corresponds precisely with tonight's alignment. Sir Richard stared at the medallion with evident discomfort. "I had no idea. When we donated these items, they seemed merely of historical interest. And yet your family kept them sealed away for centuries," Holmes observed, "which suggests some knowledge of their significance." A flush rose to Sir Richard's cheeks. "Mr. Holmes, if you are implying that my family has knowingly harbored dangerous artifacts—" "I imply nothing," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "I merely seek to understand why someone would kill to possess this medallion on the eve of a 1,000-year astronomical event." The tension was broken by the sudden appearance of a young man at the chamber's entrance. Tall and athletic, with a military bearing despite his civilian attire. "Father?" Stephen said we had guests. His gaze swept curiously over our party. "Ah, my son has returned earlier than expected," Sir Richard said, his relief at the interruption evident. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Lieutenant James Hargreaves, recently of His Majesty's diplomatic service in Eastern Europe." As we exchanged greetings, I observed Holmes studying the young man with unusual intensity. Lieutenant Hargreaves, for his part, seemed particularly interested in Latimer, whom he regarded with an expression I could not quite decipher. "These gentlemen are investigating some historical aspects of our family artifacts," Sir Richard explained to his son. "Mr. Holmes is the renowned detective from London." "Indeed?" The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. "I've read of your exploits, sir. Though I confess I'm surprised that ancient history would draw someone of your talents to our remote corner of England." "History has a remarkable way of influencing present events, Lieutenant," Holmes replied. "Your family's donations to the British Museum have become entangled in a most contemporary crime." A shadow seemed to pass across the young man's features. "How distressing. I hope I might be of some assistance during your stay." "Your knowledge of the estate could prove invaluable," Holmes acknowledged, "particularly regarding the stone circle we hope to visit this afternoon." "I'd be happy to guide you there myself," Lieutenant Hargreaves offered. "I know every inch of these grounds from boyhood explorations." As we concluded our examination of the chamber and returned to the upper levels of the house, I noticed Latimer, growing increasingly agitated, his eyes darting nervously whenever the medallion was mentioned. Holmes, too, seemed to have registered our client's escalating anxiety, for he deftly changed the subject to more neutral historical matters. We retired to prepare for the afternoon expedition, with Holmes and I sharing a comfortable guest suite overlooking the eastern woods. The moment we were alone, Holmes moved to the window, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Our scarred friend has arrived," he said quietly. I caught a glimpse of him at the edge of the woods as we entered the house. "And what of our hosts?" I asked. "Sir Richard seemed genuinely surprised by your revelations." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his expression thoughtful. "But his son's unexpected return troubles me, particularly given his diplomatic posting in Eastern Europe." "You suspect the lieutenant might be involved?" "I suspect, Watson, that Ravenswood Manor holds far more secrets than a single hidden chamber." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. "Tonight's alignment approaches, and with it, I believe, the culmination of our mystery. We must be prepared for whatever may unfold at the stone circle." "And the medallion?" I asked, glancing at Holmes's coat where the artifact now rested. "The key to everything," Holmes replied gravely. "And perhaps, if our adversary's beliefs hold, any truth. Far more." Chapter 8. The Stone Circle. The afternoon brought a subtle shift in the weather. As we prepared to depart for the Stone Circle, the morning's mist had given way to a crystalline clarity, the autumn sky deepening to a shade of blue that seemed almost artificial in its intensity. Lieutenant Hargreaves awaited us in the grand entrance hall, now dressed for outdoor activity in sturdy boots and a tweed jacket, a walking stick in hand. "The path can be treacherous in places," he explained as we set out, leading us around the east wing of the manor toward a narrow trail that disappeared into the dense woodland. These woods have never been properly tamed, despite generations of Hargreaves' stewardship. Holmes walked slightly ahead with our guide, leaving me to accompany Latimer, whose nervous demeanor had not improved since our arrival. The curator clutched his coat tightly around himself. Chapter 8. The Stone Circle. The afternoon brought a subtle shift in the weather. As we prepared to depart for the Stone Circle, the morning's mist had given way to a crystalline clarity, the autumn sky deepening to a shade of blue that seemed almost artificial in its intensity. Lieutenant Hargreaves awaited us in the grand entrance hall, now dressed for outdoor activity in sturdy boots and a tweed jacket, a walking stick in hand. "The path can be treacherous in places," he explained, as we set out, leading us around the east wing of the manor toward a narrow trail that disappeared into the dense woodland. These woods have never been properly tamed, despite generations of Hargreaves' stewardship. Holmes walked slightly ahead with our guide, leaving me to accompany Latimer, whose nervous demeanor had not improved since our arrival. The curator clutched his coat tightly around himself despite the mild temperature, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. "Are you unwell, Mr. Latimer?" I inquired quietly. "Just anxious, Doctor," he replied. "I cannot shake the feeling that we are being watched, not just by our scarred pursuer, but by something else." I might have dismissed such sentiment as mere nerves had I not experienced a similar sensation since our arrival at Ravenswood. There was something in the atmosphere of the place, a heaviness, an expectancy, that affected even my practical nature. The woodland path wound steadily upward, eventually opening onto a plateau where ancient oaks gave way to a circular clearing. At its center stood what remained of the Stone Circle, 7 massive monoliths arranged in a perfect ring, with an 8th, larger stone at the precise center. Each stood approximately 12 feet tall, their surfaces weathered by centuries of exposure yet still bearing visible carvings similar to those we had observed in the underground chamber. "Remarkable preservation," Holmes commented, approaching the nearest stone to examine the markings. "Far older than the Norman period, I would suggest." "Celtic, according to the family chronicles," Lieutenant Hargreaves confirmed, though the central stone was reportedly added later during the Saxon era. Holmes circled the central monolith with evident interest. Unlike its companions, this stone was rectangular and bore more elaborate carvings, prominent among them the now familiar Ouroboros symbol. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, comparing the stone's markings with the medallion he had withdrawn from his pocket. "The patterns are identical, down to the finest detail." "The medallion was discovered with a depression in its center," Latimer observed, his scholarly instincts momentarily overcoming his anxiety. "Almost as if it were meant to be fitted into a larger structure." Holmes examined the central stone, more closely running his fingers along its weathered surface, until he paused at a circular indentation approximately 5 feet from the ground. "Like this, perhaps?" he suggested. The depression was precisely the size and shape of the medallion. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "Do you suppose that's what our adversary intends? To place the medallion into that slot during tonight's alignment?" "It would appear so," Holmes agreed. "The question remains, to what purpose?" Lieutenant Hargreaves had been watching our examination with an expression of calculated neutrality that now gave way to apparent curiosity. "You gentlemen speak of an adversary. Is Ravenswood in some danger?" "Potentially," Holmes replied, studying the young man's reaction. Someone has already committed murder to acquire this medallion, and Mr. Latimer has received explicit threats. We have reason to believe the culmination of this scheme will occur here, tonight, during the rare celestial alignment. Should we alert the local authorities? Hargreaves asked, though his tone suggested skepticism rather than genuine concern. I have already taken precautions, Holmes assured him, though I knew this to be a calculated deception. For now, I would like to understand the significance of this site to your family, Lieutenant. The chronicles you mentioned, do they explain why the Hargreaves have maintained this circle for so many centuries? A shadow seemed to pass across the young man's features. Family duty, Mr. Holmes. The first Hargreaves to hold these lands swore an oath to protect the circle and certain artifacts associated with it. Protect them from whom? I inquired. From those who would misuse them, he replied after a moment's hesitation. The chronicles speak of a brotherhood that has sought the medallion and its powers since Saxon times. They are said to believe it can open a doorway between worlds during specific astronomical alignments. And do you share these beliefs, Lieutenant? Holmes asked, his tone carefully neutral. The young man's laugh held little humor. I am a modern man, Mr. Holmes. I put my faith in diplomacy and rifles, not ancient superstitions. He glanced at the darkening eastern sky. But we should return to the house. These woods can be disorienting after nightfall, and we have a formal dinner to prepare for. As we made our way back along the forest path, I noticed that Holmes deliberately positioned himself behind Lieutenant Hargreaves, his keen eyes missing nothing of our guide's behavior. Latimer walked beside me, his earlier nervousness now replaced by a scholar's excitement. The connection between the underground chamber and this circle is unmistakable, he whispered. Both aligned to channel tonight's celestial event, both bearing the same symbolic language. Whatever the medallion's purpose, it was clearly designed as a key component in some greater mechanism. A mechanism for what? I wondered aloud. Latimer shook his head. I cannot say, but the repeated motif of the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail, traditionally represents cycles, eternity, the unending nature of time itself. Our conversation ceased as we emerged from the forest path into the manor's sculptured gardens. Sir Richard awaited us on the terrace, his expression suggesting concern. I was about to send a search party, he remarked as we approached. These woods have claimed unwary visitors before. We were in excellent hands with Lieutenant Hargreaves, Holmes assured him. The stone circle is a most impressive archaeological site. And a family responsibility, Sir Richard added pointedly. One we have maintained for nearly a millennium, despite changing times and beliefs. A responsibility that may face its greatest test tonight, Holmes replied, his tone equally pointed. I would strongly advise heightened vigilance, Sir Richard. Your son has informed us of the legends surrounding the circle and the medallion. Legends that have driven at least one man to murder. Something unspoken seemed to pass between father and son, a moment of silent communication that concluded, with Sir Richard giving a nearly imperceptible nod. We shall discuss this further after dinner, Mr. Holmes, he said. For now, I suggest you and your companions rest and refresh yourselves. The evening promises to be eventful. As we retired to our rooms to prepare for dinner, Holmes pulled me aside, his voice lowered to ensure privacy. Watson, keep the revolver close at hand tonight. I have observed several details that suggest our hosts are not being entirely forthcoming about their knowledge of the medallion and its significance. You suspect the Hargreaves are involved in Jenkins' death? I asked, startled. I suspect that the family oath to protect the stone circle and its artifacts may have multiple interpretations, Holmes replied cryptically. And I am increasingly convinced that Lieutenant Hargreaves' unexpected return from diplomatic service is no coincidence. And our scarred pursuer? A key piece in this elaborate game, Holmes murmured. One whose role may prove crucial in the hours to come. As evening shadows lengthened across the ancient estate, I could not shake the sensation that Ravenswood Manor itself was holding its breath, waiting, like us, for the imminent celestial alignment and whatever mysteries it might reveal. Chapter 9. Revelations by Firelight. Dinner at Ravenswood Manor was a strangely tense affair, conducted with all the proper formalities of aristocratic hospitality, yet underlaid with currents of unspoken concern. We dined in the great hall beneath the watchful gaze of Hargreaves' ancestors whose portraits lined the oak-paneled walls. Sir Richard presided at the head of the table, his son at his right hand, while Holmes, Latimer, and I occupied the remaining places. The conversation remained superficially pleasant, touching on London society, developments in archaeological methodology, and the lieutenant's diplomatic experiences abroad. Yet I noticed how carefully certain topics were avoided. No mention was made of the medallion, the stone circle, or the approaching alignment. Holmes, for his part, observed our hosts with his characteristic penetrating gaze, missing nothing. Of their subtle exchanges and occasional glances toward the tall windows, where darkness had now fully descended. As the meal concluded and brandy was served, Sir Richard dismissed the servants with a discreet gesture. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly once we were alone, the veneer of casual sociability giving way to a more urgent reality. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Richard began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "you spoke earlier of murder and threats connected to our family artifacts. I believe the time has come for complete frankness between us." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, setting aside his untouched brandy. "Beginning, perhaps, with an acknowledgement that the Hargreaves family has maintained the stone circle not merely out of historical interest, but because of its perceived power." A moment of silence followed this direct statement. Father and son exchanged glances before Sir Richard responded. "For nearly 1,000 years, my family has been entrusted with guarding what some would call a doorway, a nexus point where, under specific astronomical conditions, the boundary between our world and something else grows thin." "You speak as though you believe such a boundary exists," I remarked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Lieutenant Hargreaves gave a short, humorless laugh. "Belief is irrelevant, Doctor. The chronicles document 11 previous alignments since the Norman conquest. During each, phenomena occurred that defied rational explanation." "What manner of phenomena?" Holmes inquired. "Disturbances in natural law," Sir Richard replied carefully. "Objects moving without apparent cause. Sounds emanating from empty air. On 3 occasions, records describe human figures that appeared briefly before vanishing. The most recent alignment in 1066 preceded the Norman invasion and the fall of Saxon England." Latimer, who had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, suddenly spoke. "The manuscript fragments mention a guardian sacrifice required to seal the doorway. Is that why your family maintained possession of these artifacts for so long? To prevent such a sacrifice?" Another loaded glance passed between our hosts. "Yes and no," Sir Richard finally answered. "The medallion was indeed kept secure to prevent misuse, but not just any sacrifice will affect the doorway. The texts speak of blood of the appointed guardian being necessary." "And who is this appointed guardian?" Holmes asked, though his expression suggested he had already deduced the answer. "A Hargreaves," the lieutenant replied flatly. "Always a Hargreaves. The obligation passes from generation to generation, activated only during the alignment years." The implications of this statement hung heavily in the air. I found myself struggling to reconcile such mystical concepts with the rational world. I knew. Holmes, however, seemed to accept this information as merely another piece in the puzzle he was assembling. "And your family donated the medallion to the museum because," he prompted. Sir Richard sighed deeply. "Because I believed the old ways were superstition. Scientific advancement has explained so much that once seemed magical. I thought perhaps the time had come to relegate family myths to the realm of historical curiosity." Until a man was murdered and the alignment approached, Holmes observed. Precisely. Sir Richard's expression was grave. When Mr. Latimer's telegram arrived mentioning the medallion, I realized my error in judgment. Some traditions exist for good reason, regardless of whether modern minds can explain them. Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes moving between father and son. You've spoken of those who would misuse the medallion. Who exactly poses this threat? They call themselves the Order of the Eternal Serpent, Lieutenant Hargreaves answered. A brotherhood dating back to pagan times, believing that the doorway can grant immortality to those who control it. They seek not to close the breach, but to exploit it. A brotherhood with a particular symbol, perhaps? Holmes withdrew the scrap of fabric he had discovered in the museum's ventilation duct, displaying the partial insignia visible upon it. A serpent devouring its tail. Sir Richard paled visibly. Where did you find this? At the scene of Jenkins' murder, Holmes replied. Left by a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek. Lieutenant Hargreaves' hand tightened around his brandy glass. Casimir. He was in London then. You know this man? I asked, startled by this connection. We encountered each other during my diplomatic service in the Balkans, the lieutenant replied carefully. He represents certain interests that have long sought artifacts like our medallion. And now he has followed us to Ravenswood, Holmes concluded, which suggests the Order's plan centers on tonight's alignment and the stone circle we visited today. Sir Richard rose abruptly. Then we must prepare. The alignment reaches its apex at midnight, less than 3 hours from now. Latimer, who had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange, suddenly clutched at his chest, his breathing becoming labored. Mr. Latimer? I moved to his side with professional concern. Are you unwell? My heart, he gasped. An old condition, exacerbated by stress. My medication. In my room. I shall fetch it, Lieutenant Hargreaves offered, but Holmes raised a hand to stop him. Allow Dr. Watson to assist Mr. Latimer, he suggested, his tone brooking no argument. While we continue our discussion of tonight's defensive strategy, I helped the trembling curator from his chair, supporting him as we left the great hall. Once we were alone in the corridor, Latimer's demeanor changed dramatically. His breathing steadied, and he straightened with surprising vigor. A necessary deception, Doctor, he whispered urgently. I must speak with you privately. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. The medallion? Holmes still carries it? Yes, I confirmed, increasingly confused by his behavior. What is this about, Latimer? We are all in grave danger, he replied, his voice barely audible. Not just from this Casimir character, but from within Ravenswood itself. The lieutenant. A sudden noise from a connecting passage silenced him. Latimer's expression transformed to one of abject terror. Before I could question him further, he broke away from me and hurried toward the guest wing, leaving me bewildered in the dimly lit corridor. When I returned to the great hall, the atmosphere had grown even more tense. Holmes was examining a collection of ancient documents that Sir Richard had produced from a hidden compartment in the fireplace mantelpiece. Yellowed parchments covered in the same runic script we had observed on the medallion. Ah, Watson, Holmes greeted me. How is our curator? Resting, I replied, deciding to keep Latimer's strange behavior to myself until I could speak with Holmes privately. What have I missed? Sir Richard has been sharing the family chronicles regarding previous alignments, Holmes explained, his tone neutral though his eyes conveyed that significant developments had occurred in my absence. It seems our course of action is clear. We must prevent anyone from placing the medallion in the central stone during the critical moment of alignment, which occurs at precisely midnight, Sir Richard added, consulting an ornate astronomical clock on the mantelpiece. We have little time to prepare. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, an unnatural silence seemed to fall over Ravenswood Manor. Even the crackling of the great fire seemed muted, as though the ancient house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the approaching celestial event and the mysteries it might unleash. Chapter X. Midnight approaches. "Watson, a word," Holmes murmured, drawing me aside as Sir Richard and his son huddled over the ancient documents. We moved to a window alcove where the velvet drapes afforded a modicum of privacy. "Latimer's condition was a pretense, I presume?" Holmes asked quietly. "Indeed," I confirmed, impressed yet again by my friend's perceptive faculties. He seemed desperate to speak privately, claiming we faced danger from within Ravenswood itself. He specifically mentioned the lieutenant before something interrupted. "Us." Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "My suspicions align with his concerns. Have you noticed the lieutenant's left hand? I confess I have not observed anything remarkable about it. The slight stiffness in his final two fingers, the particular callus on his thumb, characteristic of extensive laboratory work with caustic chemicals." Holmes's voice dropped even lower. "And there is a faint discoloration beneath his right cuff, the same distinctive shade produced by the mixture of atropine and prussic acid derivatives we identified on the medallion." A chill ran through me as the implications became clear. "You believe Lieutenant Hargreaves killed Jenkins?" "And threatened Latimer, yes." Holmes glanced toward our hosts, ensuring they remained occupied. His diplomatic posting provided perfect cover for involvement with this Order of the Eternal Serpent. Note how readily he identified our scarred pursuer, Casimir, claiming to have encountered him during his service abroad. "But his own father guards the medallion," I objected. "Why would he?" "Divided loyalties, perhaps, or a more sinister possibility, that both Hargreaves' men are not what they appear." Holmes withdrew the medallion from his pocket, studying it in the firelight. "Tonight's alignment approaches rapidly. I believe we must separate, Watson." "Separate? Surely that's unwise given the circumstances." "On the contrary, it's essential. I need you to find Latimer and ensure his safety. His attempted communication suggests he possesses knowledge critical to unraveling this mystery." Holmes pressed the medallion into my hand. "Take this. If I am correct, both our hosts and this Casimir will focus their attention on me, assuming I still carry it." I reluctantly pocketed the ancient artifact, its metal unnaturally cold against my palm. "And what will you do?" "Spring the trap that has been carefully laid for us," Holmes replied with the familiar gleam in his eye that accompanied his most daring strategies. "Meet me at the stone circle at 11:30, approaching from the eastern path to avoid detection. Whatever forces converge there tonight, we must be prepared to counter them." Our conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Hargreaves, who approached with a decanter of brandy. "Another drink, gentlemen? The night grows cold and we have preparations to make before midnight." "Thank you, no," Holmes replied smoothly. "Dr. Watson was just remarking that he should check on Mr. Latimer's condition." "Of course," the lieutenant nodded, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "The guest wing is easily missed in this labyrinthine house. Shall I escort you, Doctor?" "That won't be necessary," I assured him, feigning confidence I did not feel. I recall the way perfectly. I departed with a significant glance at Holmes, who had already engaged Sir Richard in discussion of the family chronicles, drawing attention away from my exit. The corridors of Ravenswood Manor seemed darker now, the electric lights casting elongated shadows that danced with each flicker. I moved quickly toward the guest wing, my hand occasionally touching the reassuring shape of my service revolver. Latimer's room appeared empty when I knocked and cautiously entered, the bed undisturbed. I was about to withdraw when a slight movement from the adjoining dressing room caught my attention. "Latimer?" I called softly. The curator emerged, his face ashen with fear. "Dr. Watson, thank heaven. I feared you might be someone else." "Holmes sent me to ensure your safety," I explained. "And to hear what you were trying to tell me earlier." Latimer glanced nervously at the door. "We must speak elsewhere." The walls in these old houses have ears, I finished for him. Very well. Where? There's a servant's staircase at the end of this corridor. It leads to the kitchens, which should be deserted at this hour. We made our way cautiously through the dimly lit passage, every creaking floorboard amplified in the unnatural silence that had descended over the manor. The narrow servants' stairs were illuminated only by a single gas lamp, casting grotesque shadows as we descended to the lower level. The kitchen was indeed empty. The evening's dining preparations, long concluded. Only the dull red glow of banked coals in the massive range provided illumination. Latimer seemed to relax marginally once we were alone, amid the copper pots and hanging utensils. "The lieutenant is not what he seems," he whispered urgently. "When Jenkins was killed, I received a letter, not a threat, but a warning from someone claiming to be a former diplomatic colleague of Lieutenant Hargreaves." "What manner of warning?" "That Hargreaves had been dismissed from the diplomatic service 6 months ago under mysterious circumstances involving the disappearance of ancient artifacts from a Balkan monastery." Latimer's hands trembled as he spoke. "The letter claimed he had joined a secret society obsessed with occult practices. The Order of the Eternal Serpent," I supplied. "Yes, you know of them?" "Our hosts have been forthcoming about certain aspects of this affair," I explained, "though Holmes suspects their candor may disguise deeper deceptions." "The father and son are not aligned in purpose," Latimer insisted. "I observed their interactions at the museum when they first brought the artifacts. Sir Richard genuinely believed these objects belonged in academic custody, while the lieutenant argued vehemently against the donation. This new information aligned with Holmes's suspicions." "Did your correspondent explain why the Order desires the medallion?" "Only vaguely, something about crossing the threshold during the alignment. But there was a detail about the ritual that disturbs me greatly." Latimer's voice dropped even lower. "It requires blood sacrifice from a vessel of passage, someone who has handled the medallion extensively." A chill ran through me as I grasped the implications. "Someone like you, who cataloged it at the museum." "Or Jenkins before me," Latimer nodded grimly. "I believe he was not just killed, but ritually prepared." Mrs. Winters described a bluish tint to his fingernails, the same discoloration mentioned in the manuscript fragments as marking the chosen vessel. The grandfather clock in the hall above struck 11, its somber tones reverberating through the silent house. Latimer started nervously at the sound. "We have 1 hour until the alignment peaks," I said, making a swift decision. "Holmes instructed me to meet him at the stone circle. You must come with me. You'll be safer there under our direct protection." "No," Latimer shook his head emphatically. "I believe I've been marked for the ritual. My presence at the circle would play directly into their hands." He straightened, showing unexpected resolve. "I must leave Ravenswood immediately, breaking their ceremonial connection." Before I could respond, a soft noise from the corridor outside froze us both. The kitchen door opened slowly to reveal the tall, gaunt figure of a man I had never seen before. A vivid scar crossed his left cheek, his eyes cold as winter frost as he surveyed us. "A wise concern, Mr. Latimer," he said in heavily accented English. "But I fear your departure would inconvenience us greatly." He stepped fully into the kitchen, a revolver gleaming in his hand. "And you, Dr. Watson, I believe you carry something that belongs to the Order." My hand moved instinctively toward my coat pocket where the medallion rested. "I would advise against any heroics, Doctor," the scarred man, Casimir, presumably warned. "The hour approaches, and there is still much to prepare." From the doorway behind him emerged Lieutenant Hargreaves, his aristocratic features set in, a cold smile that confirmed our worst suspicions. "Thank you for gathering our essential components in one convenient location, Dr. Watson," the lieutenant said smoothly. "The medallion and our chosen vessel. Most efficient." As they advanced into the kitchen, I calculated our chances of escape and found them vanishingly small. Whatever Holmes had planned for the stone circle, he would now face it alone, while Latimer and I confronted a more immediate peril within the ancient walls of Ravenswood Manor. Chapter 13. The final gambit. Lieutenant Hargreaves, I said, attempting to buy time as I assessed our predicament. Your father will be most distressed to learn of your alliance with the very order your family has opposed for centuries. A flicker of emotion, not guilt, but something closer to contempt, crossed the young man's features. My father is a custodian who has forgotten the true purpose of his charge. The Hargreaves were never meant merely to guard the doorway, but to master it. The chronicles suggest otherwise, I countered, slowly shifting my position to place myself between Latimer and our captors. The chronicles were written by those too fearful to seize the power within their grasp, Lieutenant Hargreaves replied dismissively. For generations, my ancestors stood watch over forces they could have commanded, content to be gatekeepers rather than conquerors. Casimir moved with surprising swiftness, circling to block any potential escape route toward the servants' staircase. Enough conversation. The medallion, Doctor, now. I reluctantly withdrew the ancient artifact from my pocket, its metal gleaming dully in the kitchen's dim light. As Casimir reached to take it, his scarred features contorted with sudden suspicion. This has been substituted, he hissed, examining the medallion closely. The energy signature is wrong. Where is the true artifact? Lieutenant Hargreaves seized my collar, his aristocratic veneer crumbling into raw fury. Holmes has deceived us. Where is he? I don't know what you mean, I insisted, genuinely confused. Holmes had given me the medallion directly from his pocket, the same one we had examined throughout our investigation. Casimir and Hargreaves exchanged dark glances. There is no time to search the entire manor, the scarred man said urgently. The alignment approaches its apex. We proceed with what we have, Hargreaves decided grimly. This vessel, he gestured contemptuously toward the trembling Latimer, and the replica. Holmes must have taken the original to the stone circle. We will meet him there. And Dr. Watson? Casimir inquired, his revolver still trained steadily on my chest. Hargreaves considered me with cold calculation. Bring him. Additional leverage may prove useful if Holmes proves uncooperative. We were forced at gunpoint through a back entrance of the manor, following a path that skirted the manicured gardens and led directly into the dense woodland. The night had grown unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the ancient oaks. No nocturnal creatures called from the underbrush. Above us, the sky had cleared completely, revealing stars of unusual brilliance and a particular configuration of planets, visible to the naked eye, their alignment forming a pattern that matched the arrangement depicted in the manuscript illustrations. Latimer stumbled beside me, his academic's physique ill-suited to the rough terrain. Watson, he whispered during a moment when our captors were navigating a particularly narrow section of path. If I don't survive this night, tell Holmes that the inscription, the part about the guardian's sacrifice, it's been mistranslated. It doesn't require blood to close the doorway, but to open it. Before I could respond, Casimir prodded us forward with his weapon. Silence. We approached the sacred ground. The stone circle loomed ahead, its massive monoliths silhouetted against the starlit sky. As we entered the ancient site, I was startled to find Sir Richard already present, standing rigid beside the central stone, with an expression of profound dismay. James, he addressed his son, what is the meaning of this? Why are these men being held at gunpoint? The culmination of generations of wasted potential, Father, Lieutenant Hargreaves replied, his voice hardening. Tonight, the Hargreaves' legacy transforms from passive guardianship to active dominion. Sir Richard's face paled in the starlight. You've joined them. The Order. How could you betray our sacred trust? The only betrayal was denying our family its rightful power, the lieutenant countered. The ancients knew that the boundary between worlds could be more than merely guarded. It could be controlled, exploited. At what cost? Sir Richard demanded. The texts are explicit about the price of such ambition. A price I am prepared to pay, his son replied coldly. With another's blood. Casimir had circled the perimeter of the stone ring, his gaze sweeping the shadows. Where is Holmes? He should be here with the true medallion. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a figure emerged from the darkness beyond the circle. Not Holmes, but a disheveled museum-cleaning woman I recognized as Mrs. Winters. She staggered forward, her eyes wide with confusion. "You!" Latimer gasped. "How are you here?" The woman's features shifted in the strange light, her posture straightening as she pulled away a wig and false garments to reveal the lean form of Sherlock Holmes. "An elementary disguise," my friend remarked calmly, stepping into the circle. "Though effective enough to allow me to follow our adversaries undetected." Lieutenant Hargreaves recovered quickly from his surprise. "A clever ruse, Mr. Holmes, but ultimately futile. The medallion, I know you have the true artifact. Surrender it immediately, or Dr. Watson's life is forfeit." Holmes appeared unmoved by the threat, his gaze traveling methodically around the stone circle as if making final calculations. "You seem quite certain there are two medallions, Lieutenant. An interesting deduction." "Do not play games," Casimir snarled. "We know the Hargreaves kept the true power and donated a replica to the museum." A thin smile crossed Holmes's face. "Indeed, though not in the manner you imagine." He turned to Sir Richard. "Your son believes you deceived the museum, but I suspect the deception runs deeper. The medallion in Watson's possession is the very one catalogued by Mr. Latimer, the one that was involved in Jenkins' death." Sir Richard's expression confirmed Holmes's assertion. "The true medallion never left Ravenswood," he admitted heavily. "It has remained concealed within the central stone for generations, removed only briefly during each alignment to prevent its activation." Lieutenant Hargreaves' face contorted with rage. "You knew? All this time, while I searched desperately through the Order's ancient texts for the ritual components, you possessed the key?" "To protect you from exactly this madness," Sir Richard replied bitterly. "The Order has seduced generations of power-hungry men with false promises of transcendence." "False?" Casimir laughed harshly. "The doorway is real enough. Tonight, we will prove it, and pass through." The strange, electric tension in the air intensified as the clock in my pocket indicated mere minutes until midnight. Above us, the celestial alignment approached its perfect configuration, stars seeming to pulse with unnatural brilliance. "The time comes," Casimir intoned. "The vessel must be prepared." He gestured toward Latimer with his revolver. Holmes stepped forward. "Before you proceed with this ill-conceived ritual, perhaps you should understand exactly what you're attempting to unleash." His voice carried a certainty that captured everyone's attention. "The manuscripts speak not of a doorway to power or immortality, but of a breach, a wound in the natural order that has threatened to widen during each alignment." "Ancient superstition," Lieutenant Hargreaves dismissed, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Science, not superstition," Holmes countered. "The electromagnetic disturbances documented during previous alignments, the gravitational anomalies, all consistent with modern theoretical physics regarding dimensional boundaries." As Holmes spoke, I noticed his subtle gestures directing my attention to the central stone. There, barely visible in the starlight, a thin seam had appeared in the ancient monolith, widening almost imperceptibly with each passing moment. "The guardianship of your family," Holmes continued, addressing Sir Richard while maintaining the distraction, "was never about protecting the medallion, but about preventing its use during the alignment, because the blood sacrifice doesn't close the breach. It tears it open," I concluded, recalling Latimer's whispered warning. The clock in my pocket chimed softly, marking the midnight hour. The alignment had reached its apex, and with it, Our final confrontation with forces both human and perhaps something far more ancient and terrible. Chapter 13. As worlds collide, as the final chime of midnight faded into the unnatural silence, a subtle vibration passed through the ancient stones, so slight that I might have imagined it had not the soil at my feet shifted perceptibly. The seam in the central monolith widened further, emitting a faint luminescence that cast eerie shadows across the weathered faces of the standing stones. "It begins," Casimir breathed, a zealot's fervor transforming his scarred features. "The boundary thins." Lieutenant Hargreaves moved toward his father with predatory intent. "The true medallion, father. Where is it hidden within the stone?" Sir Richard stood his ground with unexpected dignity. "I will not aid this madness, James, even if it costs my life. Then perhaps Dr. Watson's life instead?" The lieutenant nodded to Casimir, who immediately redirected his revolver from Latimer to me. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with calculated precision. "The medallion is already in place, Lieutenant. It was never removed from the central stone, merely concealed beneath a layer of crafted stone that your father replaced after each alignment." All eyes turned to the monolith, where the widening seam had indeed revealed a glint of gold. The edge of an embedded medallion identical to the one I carried, save for the intensity of its luster and the deeper etchings of its runes. Your father understood that the medallion itself is both key. Chapter 13. As worlds collide. As the final chime of midnight faded into the unnatural silence, a subtle vibration passed through the ancient stones, so slight that I might have imagined it had not the soil at my feet shifted perceptibly. The seam in the central monolith widened further, emitting a faint luminescence that cast eerie shadows across the weathered faces of the standing stones. "It begins," Casimir breathed, a zealot's fervor transforming his scarred features. "The boundary thins." Lieutenant Hargreaves moved toward his father with predatory intent. "The true medallion, father. Where is it hidden within the stone?" Sir Richard stood his ground with unexpected dignity. "I will not aid this madness, James, even if it costs my life." "Then perhaps Dr. Watson's life instead?" The lieutenant nodded to Casimir, who immediately redirected his revolver from Latimer to me. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with calculated precision. "The medallion is already in place, Lieutenant. It was never removed from the central stone, merely concealed beneath a layer of crafted stone that your father replaced after each alignment." All eyes turned to the monolith, where the widening seam had indeed revealed a glint of gold. The edge of an embedded medallion identical to the one I carried, save for the intensity of its luster and the deeper etchings of its runes. "Your father understood that the medallion itself is both key and lock," Holmes continued. "In its dormant position, it stabilizes the boundary. Only when removed and reinserted with ritual intent does it become the catalyst for opening the breach." "Lieutenant." Hargreaves' expression wavered between doubt and obsession. "The Order's texts speak of immortality and power beyond human comprehension for those who cross the threshold." "Deliberately misleading," Holmes countered. "Written by those who wish to ensure that ambitious men would continue attempting to activate the breach, feeding it with the sacrificial energy it requires." "Lies!" Casimir snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. A stronger tremor passed through the circle, causing us all to struggle for balance. The seam in the monolith now pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, the light within fluctuating between azure and a deep, unnatural violet. Above us, the stars themselves seemed to dim, as though some greater darkness were encroaching upon the night sky. Latimer, who had remained tremulously silent, suddenly spoke with scholarly conviction. "The manuscripts at the museum, the fragments we couldn't translate, they weren't in an unknown dialect. They were written backward, a simple encryption. I realized it this morning. They don't promise transcendence. They warn of consumption." The lieutenant wavered, academic instinct briefly overcoming blind faith. Consumption? Whatever exists. Beyond that boundary doesn't grant power, Holmes explained. It feeds on it, on life, on consciousness. Each sacrifice doesn't just open the door, it strengthens what waits beyond it. As if in response to his words, the light within the seam pulsed more violently, and a sound emerged that defied description. Neither high nor low, neither near nor distant, but somehow existing in dimensions of perception that human senses were never designed to interpret. Lieutenant Hargreaves's scholarly nature battled visibly with the indoctrination of the order. If what you say is true, then why has my father's family safeguarded this site for centuries rather than destroying the medallion entirely? Because destruction is impossible, Sir Richard answered solemnly. Many have tried. The metal reconstitutes itself over time. The boundary must be managed, not eliminated. The breach stabilized during each alignment. Another, stronger tremor shook the circle. The seam in the central stone had widened to nearly an inch, the light within now casting distinct shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The air itself felt charged, crackling with unseen energies. "We must act quickly," Holmes urged. "The alignment peaks for only minutes. Sir Richard, you know what must be done to stabilize the boundary." Before the elder Hargreaves could respond, Casimir lunged forward with fanatical purpose, seizing Latimer and dragging him toward the central stone. "The vessel's blood will open the way completely." He produced a ceremonial dagger that gleamed with unnatural brightness in the otherworldly light. I moved to intervene, but Lieutenant Hargreaves blocked my path, his own revolver now drawn. Yet I detected hesitation in his stance, the conviction in his eyes wavering as theory confronted terrifying reality. "James," Sir Richard appealed to his son, "look at what's happening. This is not the doorway to transcendence the order promised. It's something far more malevolent." The lieutenant's gaze darted between his father and the increasingly unstable phenomenon manifesting within the stone. Academic training and familial duty warred visibly with years of indoctrination. Holmes, meanwhile, had circled subtly to position, himself nearer to Casimir and Latimer. I recognized the calculating focus in his eyes. He was preparing to act, waiting for the precise moment when attention was divided. That moment came as a violent pulse of energy erupted from the widening seam, momentarily blinding us all. The replica medallion in my pocket suddenly turned scalding hot, causing me to instinctively withdraw it. As my vision cleared, I saw it floating inches above my palm, vibrating in resonance with its counterpart embedded in the stone. Casimir, distracted by this phenomenon, loosened his grip on Latimer. Holmes seized the opportunity, launching himself at the scarred cultist with precision, born of his knowledge of Baritsu. The dagger went flying as both men tumbled to the ground. Lieutenant Hargreaves stood frozen in indecision, his revolver wavering between targets as the world around us seemed to warp and distort. The stones themselves appeared to bend subtly, their shadows elongating impossibly across the ground. "James," Sir Richard called urgently to his son, "help me seal the breach. The Hargreaves' duty is to contain, not release." Something in his father's voice, perhaps the echo of 1,000 years of familial obligation, finally penetrated the lieutenant's indoctrination. With a visible shudder of resolution, he lowered his weapon and moved toward the central stone. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the increasingly dissonant sounds emanating from the breach. "The stabilization requires Hargreaves' blood freely given, not taken," Sir Richard explained, rolling up his sleeve. "A guardian's willing sacrifice creates the seal." Holmes, having subdued Casimir with a precise blow to the sternum, rejoined us at the central stone. "The replica medallion?" he instructed me urgently. "It must be pressed against the original at the moment of sealing." I approached, the floating medallion now pulsing in perfect synchronization with its counterpart. The seam had widened further, revealing glimpses of something beyond. Not darkness, but a swirling, non-Euclidean geometry that strained the limits of comprehension. Sir Richard drew a small knife from his pocket, and without hesitation, drew it across his palm. "For 1,000 years, we have maintained the boundary," he intoned, pressing his bleeding hand against the edge of the embedded medallion, blood of the guardian freely given, renewing the ancient compact. Lieutenant Hargreaves, in a moment of clarity that seemed to wash away years of deception, stepped forward and took the knife from his father. "The duty passes from generations to generation," he murmured, slicing his own palm and joining it to his father's against the stone. "Now, Watson," Holmes commanded. I pressed the replica medallion against the original, bridging the two Hargreaves' hands. The moment of contact produced a shock wave of energy that knocked us all backward, accompanied by a sound like the reverberating toll of an immense bell. The seam in the stone contracted violently, the otherworldly light intensifying before collapsing inward upon itself. For a brief, terrible moment, I glimpsed something reaching through the narrowing breach, appendages that followed no biological schema known to science, moving with horrible intelligence toward us before being abruptly severed as the stone sealed itself with a thunderous report. Silence descended upon the circle, broken only by our labored breathing. The stars above returned to their normal brightness, the uncanny vibration in the air dissipating like morning mist. The central stone stood solid and unmarked, as though the seam had never existed. Casimir lay unconscious where Holmes had left him. Latimer sat trembling upon the ground, his scholarly worldview irrevocably altered by what he had witnessed. Father and son Hargreaves remained by the central stone, their bleeding hands still pressed against its surface. Generations of family, purpose reunited in a single decisive act. Holmes helped me to my feet, his expression betraying rare amazement at what we had experienced. "The boundary is secured," he said quietly, "at least until the next alignment, centuries hence." "And the replica medallion?" I asked, noticing it had fallen to the ground, now inert and ordinary in appearance. "Its purpose fulfilled," Holmes replied. "The connection between the two artifacts has stabilized the breach completely." As we stood in the ancient circle beneath a now ordinary night sky, I knew with certainty that this case would never appear in my published accounts of Holmes's investigations. Some mysteries, I realized, were better left undocumented, not for lack of evidence, but for the sanity of a world unprepared to face certain truths that lurk at the boundaries of human understanding. Unprepared to face certain truths that lurk at the boundaries of human understanding.